This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
Oh man, Sherrone Moore needed that. Next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Tip. Caught.
They said you can't beat Ohio State. Now what?
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. Get it. Touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. Quick programming note, I'm traveling for work next week, so no Michigan Podcast a week from now, but let's talk about the week we just had. And boy, howdy, did Sherrone Moore need that. I mean, he needed that bad. And in the first quarter, it looked like, I'm getting texts from people who would know saying, throw in the damn towel, okay? That's not what you want for a first-year coach. But he said something between the first and the second quarter. He admitted he said some things he cannot repeat. And given the way the team played the next three quarters, I kind of wish he would have said those things about 5 weeks ago. All right. Nevertheless, we salvaged at least something from this season by beating our in-state rival. And, pour one out for those of you that live in the state of Michigan. I heard from several buddies of mine that are Michigan fans, booster alumni, who were just like, we at least have to win this game. It's insufferable around here when we lose it. He got her done. And he's, by the way, the first-year coach at Michigan to beat Sparty since Benny Oosterbaan in 1948. That's how long ago it was that a new coach at Michigan beat Michigan State in his first year. Now, do not get me wrong. This was not an impressive display of football by Michigan, but it was efficient. So Michigan still displayed its personnel and schematic deficiencies, but it also executed with an efficiency that it has not demonstrated much of this year. So it's not as good, but the brand looked like what we've seen be so successful here the last few years. Michigan has been among the nation's leaders in turnover margin now 3 consecutive years. It's one of the nation's worst teams in that metric so far this year. Zilch, goose egg turnovers against Michigan State. And then, of course, penalties. Michigan was the least penalized team in all of college football a year ago. 0 goose egg, no penalties against Michigan State, no sacks, very few tackles for loss. Michigan just did not beat itself. Now, you're not going to beat Oregon. You're not going to beat Ohio State. You're not going to beat Penn State. Probably this year, not going to beat Indiana by just playing solid, we didn't beat ourselves football. But if you played this way against Illinois, you win. If you played this way against Washington, you win. And if if that's the case, then you're 7-1 right now and still in the top 10, let alone 5-3 unranked and getting questions about Will Johnson and whether he's just going to go ahead and use this as an excuse to Jackson Smith and Jigba, who had a hamstring issue that cost him an entire year, and just shut this thing down for the NFL. But you didn't play this way all year long, but you played this way this weekend. So hopefully that can be something to build on moving forward. Sherrone Moore needed this badly. As I said here on the show last week, we're running out of reasons to retain this guy. And to then come out and to lose to a Michigan State team that is in clear rebuilding mode, although Jonathan Smith, I think, is a good coach, and they've been fairly solid at times this year. They're at least, competing for bowl eligibility, and that's good for a team whose win total was 4.5. They're almost already to that win total, and they probably think they should have surpassed it against us. And maybe, it's just what happens. The margin of error, unless you have a great quarterback in college football, can come down to plays like, right before the half, if Michigan State tries that run and doesn't get 15 yards and only gets 2, then they probably just take a knee. And then the next play where Aiden Childs gets strip sacked and we recover and kick the field goal to go ahead before the half, likely never happens. But that's the kind of stuff that occurs, all right, when you're not that much physically better than the teams you're playing against. The margin for error shrinks. We saw this the last 2 weeks on the road against Illinois and against Washington, and now it was our turn. And we still had to take advantage of it. We still had to execute, still had to make that kick. I'm not a Davis Warren guy at all. I don't think he's a Big Ten caliber starting quarterback, but I thought he did have a couple of very nice throws. I think the coaches finally figured out how to use him and Alex Orji together. So this all but guarantees bowl eligibility, which I guess means instead of just a complete fire everybody season, it's just going to be a trash season. So there's that. But if you were only going to go 6-6, this had to be one of them. If you're Sherrone Moore, you needed this one bad over the in-state rival, and he got it. Now, what does it mean moving forward? We'll see. Number 1 team in the nation comes to town. This is the biggest underdog at home Michigan has ever been. I've been able to verify that's at least since 1985. But given how good Michigan was in the 80s and the 70s, and that's how far back odds go for college football, I'd be really surprised that Michigan was more than a 2-touchdown underdog as it is against Oregon. The previous record, both came against Ohio State, 12.5-point underdog in 2017. Michigan had the lead in that game in the second half. And then 2009, also against Ohio State, also 12 points. Michigan never really threatened in that game, kind of hung around, but Ohio State was pretty much in control most of the way. So this is historic, and there's still a lot of great players on this Michigan team, a lot of guys whose names are getting called on the first night of the NFL draft next April in Green Bay. So if I'm Dan Lanning, I'm concerned that Michigan kind of got resurrected at least a little bit. I probably would have preferred that Michigan loses to Michigan State but beats Illinois. And that way, there's a lot of questions and a cloud around the program losing to your in-state rival. But now, since the situation was reversed, you got to think Michigan's got a little juice. Now, how much that'll matter against Oregon, I don't think a secondary without Will Johnson has much of a chance to cover those receivers. And even with Will Johnson, probably isn't going to do great covering those receivers. Oregon's defensive front, I think, against our offensive line is not a good matchup. And Michigan State ran the ball exceedingly well against Michigan on Saturday night. If anything, Sparty didn't run the ball enough. So, Oregon's offensive line, yes, I think is certainly better than Michigan State's. So there aren't a lot of matchups here that I think favor the good guys, but at least for 1 week, we got to enjoy this college football season, because if it's been a lot of things here heading into week 10, enjoyable would not be one of them. All right, let's find out what our Bucknut friend Mark Rogers thinks of all this and more, including his team's big game against Penn State Saturday, next. All right, let's find out what they think over there on the scarlet and gray other side of the septic tank. Let's bring in our buddy Mark Rogers. You got to be watching his fantastic channel here on YouTube year-round for some great college football coverage. Good to see you, brother. And let's just start with what I opened up this week's show with. I can't think of a time a first-year coach needed a win more than Sherrone Moore needed this win on Saturday over Sparty by hook or by crook, and he got it done. And he got it done, and I'll say this too, Mark, in a way that Michigan fans are accustomed to winning games. The last few years, Michigan has led the nation, or been among the nation's leaders in turnover margin, among the nation's leaders in fewest penalties committed, no penalties, no turnovers, just played a clean game. Wasn't great. They didn't look impressive, but they at least didn't go out there and beat themselves as they have, on top of being unimpressive most of the year.
No penalties, no turnovers. Let's add no sacks taken by the offense. So those are things that can be controlled across the board. Regardless of who you're playing, you can generally control, not necessarily turnovers, of course, based on the opposition, but in terms of playing a clean game. So we have piled on to Sherrone Moore, me included, for just flat out bad coaching. And there's still plenty of evidence of that in the past. But some of us allow players to improve throughout a season. I guess we can allow that for first-year head coaches as well. Bill Belichick was certainly not the same coach with the New England Patriots as he was head coaching the Cleveland Browns. He learned quite a bit. So I'm not forecasting a Hall of Fame career for Sherrone Moore. But again, the stat line that you just gave, and that is on the top line of my notes, is exactly that good coaches discipline football teams to execute and to not turn over the ball, because protecting the ball secures wins 80-85% of the time, and not to commit penalties, to be, as Sherrone Moore said during his news conference yesterday, that between the first whistle of the game and the last whistle of the game, that his team showed a lot of class, a lot of dignity, and played the game the right way. However, of course, things got out of hand after that. But this was a class effort by a team. Now, let's understand, this is Michigan State. I know it's a big win. I know it's a rivalry. It's a game that I always enjoy watching and have cherished for a long, long time from an outsider standpoint as one of the great rivalries in college football. But it is Michigan State. Let's understand, Aiden Childs is 19 years old, just barely, and this team lost to Boston College. They got completely obliterated by Oregon. Forget a somewhat respectable final score. If you watch that game, wow, they were completely outclassed. Played a little bit more competitively against Ohio State, but this is far from a class team, a first-tier team in the Big Ten. So they beat a mid-tier, to be kind, high-low tier, if there is such a thing, team in the Big Ten by a touchdown. And, of course, we know the first two drives of the game could have resulted in 14-0 Sparty, which would have been difficult to come back from. So that's my balanced approach to this at this point.
I just think there are 4 legitimate playoff potential teams in the league. And then I think there's 13 other teams that it's really going to come down to, are they playing at home? And then how do they execute? And are going to really struggle to win games on the road. And Michigan's in that group. And then there's, I would put Purdue and UCLA still at the bottom of the league, although the Bruins seem to be improving. I'll say this, Mark, I've seen worse Michigan State teams than this beat better Michigan teams than this. So what about the state of the rivalry too? I'd love to get your perspective as an outsider, because you mentioned more extracurricular activities. I can think of in 2007, there was, kind of a pregame free-for-all between Michigan and Ohio State at the Big House. There's the infamous 1973 game where Woody had the Buckeyes come out of our tunnel and tear down the Go Blue sign over the banner that Michigan famously touches coming out of the game. But beyond that, I remember the conversation you and I had a few years ago when one of our captains took J.K. Dobbins' shoe off or something, if I remember right, or tried to untie his shoe or something. And I'm like, that is beneath the dignity of this rivalry, not to mention Michigan football, just total douche move, garbage. By and large, I just don't recall that kind of on the field stuff and after the game stuff where Michigan and Ohio State is concerned, as what we're seeing now become, a rite of passage here with Michigan State and Michigan. And there's some talk on the Michigan side of this just needs to be removed as a protected rivalry at this point. The league, by the way, came out with a statement right before you and I were taping saying they looked into it. They don't think any further action is needed, nor can they discern from the video what was even going on there. But what do you think? It just seems as if this thing has gotten increasingly toxic, this in-state rivalry here, going back to Mike Hart's little brother comments and then Mark D'Antonio from a strategic standpoint, rightfully milked that for all that it's worth. And you know, he had the ridiculous comments that the MSU AD made last year that his players, the safety is at stake. I mean, it just, there's an increasingly call for some form of a pause button on this series to let it just kind of smooth out for a few years. What's your take on that?
I tend to really run from those type people that make those kind of decisions, that run from problems. Address the issue. Don't try to hide it somewhere. Address the issue. We have way too much of that going on in society. This is how we address issues. We try to circumvent them in some way instead of addressing them. So I do not agree with that at all, that there should be football matchups based on some type of conduct issue. No, deal with the conduct. Don't adjust the schedule. The schedule should be the schedule and should be determined based on the model that's given to these teams. And Michigan State need to play every year. They're rivals. They're in-state rivals. In terms of
how would you address it then? What would you suggest? How would you address it?
Well, do we have anything other than these two incidents in the last 3 years? The last two times they played at Michigan, correct? We had this after the game, which I actually have not seen this incident. I only heard about it. I did not go back and watch it and remember, of course, the tunnel incident from 2 years ago. But these are the two incidents, correct?
By and large, I mean, there's lots of legends about what goes on during the game at the bottom of piles and that kind of stuff, you know, year after year after year. But in terms of after the game, even go back to 2019, remember we were blowing them out and one of the Michigan State players basically got ejected for body slamming Shea Patterson when the game was clearly out of reach. So I'm sure if you talk to, you know, some Sparties, they can regale you with tales of how, you know, Michigan players have treated them similarly over the years. So, yeah.
It sounds like the people that suggest that would be suggesting that you raise the speed limit in the state of Georgia to 150 miles an hour to accommodate Georgia football players. That's not how you handle situations.
Fair. That's fair. Okay, let's talk about where this program goes from here, because this actually was a big week on the recruiting trail for Michigan. Michigan signed its highest, or got a commitment from its highest rated offensive line commitment in, I mean, I'm trying to think of the last time we got an offensive line commitment as rated as high as Andrew Babalola, and I cannot think of one. He, I think, is like the 5th top 100 recruit that Michigan has a commitment for in this class, which is more than it did the previous two classes combined. What's kind of been the worst kept secret in Michigan recruiting circles for the last couple of weeks has now gone public with the Bryce Underwood thing. And let me just say, and I know this for a fact, the Dave Portnoy thing is not involved in Bryce Underwood in any shape or form. That's a separate thing going on there. Okay. But there's a lot of smoke now that he's the consensus #1 player in the class from down the street in Belleville. So what's the big deal? Well, he barely paid any attention to Michigan as a recruit. I mean, he came, finally we got him to come on a visit for the Michigan-Ohio State game last year. He left at halftime. All right. So, I mean, this would be a pretty big flip. It's also indicative, I think, though, that Michigan has finally decided to join the modern world and realize that it's going to have to start, you know, paying for labor now in a market economy called college football. Getting maybe they're on the verge of a flip of one of the top corner prospects in the country who's committed to Georgia. So we're talking about flipping guys that are at LSU and Georgia, where you and I both know, Mark, they ain't going to school for free. Okay, so that clearly indicates a paradigm shift on the Michigan recruiting front. Your thoughts?
Well, I think we started to see that shift last year, didn't we, with retaining the football team coming back? That in no way was cheap. So that was a first step. Certainly wasn't throwing money at 17-year-olds, but that's the cost of college football and staying in competition. But again, for them to take the step to say, we want to retain what we have and to play for a championship, and we know that these guys' hearts are in it, but hey, they have to make business decisions as well. So we're going to start throwing money around to retain a team that can make a run at a national championship, and it paid off. And so now this is the next step. It's to, sometimes you have to get kicked in the head. And for Michigan, it's only been 6 or 7 games. It's not been 3 years for them to realize that we need to throw some money at these players. And this is the way business is conducted going forward. Some of the recruiting trends in this country, in this college football landscape, are quite curious. They're pretty obvious, but they're curious at the same time when Auburn is playing just horrendous football, no signs of life otherwise, and they just go on a month's run of securing just all sorts of 5 stars. That's what's going on.
What's your view of Michigan's chances against Oregon this weekend? Looks like it's going to be a nice day. Temps in the mid-50s, but serious weather as of right now. You have the 2 time zone thing, of course, but I don't know how much that really matters when you're the number 1 team in the country. If I were Dan Lanning, I'd be concerned. I would have preferred that Michigan beat Illinois and then lose to Michigan State. Okay, and I catch them coming off a rivalry loss with their daubers down, because the thing I would be concerned about, Oregon. Man 1 to 22 is the better team, but there is still a top level of talent on Michigan's roster, that guys that could take over a game. Okay. A Mason Graham that could just take over the line of scrimmage and have an all-American game where he's got 2.5 sacks and 4 tackles for loss, and he's just wrecking your offensive line all game long. You still have some of that kind of talent. If I were Dan Lanning, the concern I would have is that a talented team whose season looked over now suddenly looks like maybe they've got some juice and some life left, and they're not, and there's no pressure on them at all. They're not playing. So, throw it all out, see what you got. Kirk Campbell's basically coaching for his job as the offensive coordinator still. That would be the concern that I would have if I were Oregon. But beyond that, I'm not sure how concerned I would be. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it kind of has the feel of, let's say, the first thing that came to mind was the, aged Cowboys teams of the early to mid 1980s that were still getting back to NFC championship games, trying to hold off the Eagles and the Redskins, who were much younger and more poised and more explosive. But yes, this Michigan team, they're proud. They have fighters on this team, guys that have already proven that they can step up to any level of pressure. And we know what the obvious pressure of going through the gauntlet of a national championship run. But on top of that, some would argue the most pressure that anyone has faced under a microscope of NCAA violations or allegations at the same time. And therefore, these guys are, for their age, hardened veteran players with a ton of talent. And like you say, at the top end of the chain there. And then, of course, they're in the big house. And this might get their juices flowing, and really, this is our opportunity, even if we ride home with 3 to 4 losses this season and don't sniff the playoffs, that, hey, we make our mark on this, we defend, in a sense, our national championship against the number 1 team. It could be skewed in such a way to say, this is our national title defense. We're taking on the number 1 team in the country. We are defending the old guard of the Big Ten. And we want to show that we haven't gone and run away, but we're still fighters and we're still champions. So on a given day, I just think that this is an intriguing matchup. And of course, Oregon's on a roll. Now, they're not going to play perfect games for the next 6 or 7 weeks like they have the last 6 weeks. They've pretty much played flawless football ever since those first 2 weeks of the season. So that has to end at some point. I expect a tremendous game. Texas, of course, is the equivalent in regards to not necessarily scheme on the offensive side, but a similar caliber team. And we'll see if Michigan has learned anything, or their coaching staff has learned anything from that, because, again, we got Davis Warren back at quarterback to face that caliber of speed and explosiveness on the other side of the ball. And I know that I stated at the time that I would have opted, not that it was an ideal situation, no option was clear at quarterback, but that I would have thought that coaching 3 or 4 mistakes out of Davis Warren, I said this, I think, after the Arkansas State game, coaching 3 or 4 mistakes out of Davis Warren per week might be the best option.
When I tell you that at least since 1985, that's as far back in the database as I could go, this is the biggest underdog Michigan has ever been. And the previous 2 highs were Ohio State at home, previous home underdog, I should say, Michigan's ever been. And given how good Michigan football was in the 80s and the 70s, the database goes back to the 70s. I'm pretty confident Michigan was never a 2-touchdown underdog at home in either of those decades. So we're talking about the only 2 times it's been this way. 2017, Ohio State was a 12.5-point favorite over Michigan at the Big House. And ended up winning that game, but they had to come from behind in the fourth quarter to win that game. And then in 2009, Rich Rod's second year, they were 12-point favorites, and Michigan hung around, but it was never really in doubt in that game for Ohio State that year. So this is the biggest underdog at home Michigan has ever been, according to the odds makers. When I tell you that, your reaction is what?
Well, I go to the analytics and I go to the numbers that I like to collect. And first of all, if you're just looking at the landscape of college football, there have been far more double-digit underdog wins this season than last season. There were 18 in the Power 5 last season. I don't have the number for you right there, but it's in the 20s already in terms of double-digit underdogs through week 9. So we're seeing crazy scores out there. I think Michigan has more than a puncher's chance in this game.
You do?
And,
okay.
Oh, absolutely, I do. I think that, if Oregon's on top of its game, and Oregon has been wildly impressive. Like, I thought 3 weeks ago I was kind of shunning off the Ohio State loss there. I was kind of pushing back on, They played well. They only lost by 1 point. They the game in field goal range. But after what we saw in Columbus this week, there is a decided gap right now. Not that it can't change between these two teams, Oregon, Ohio State. Right now, Oregon is just playing. They're playing better than anybody in the country. But there
That's
are
why they're number one
season.
Yeah. Final thing then, since you mentioned Ohio State, I'd be remiss, and we've only got 31 more days to remind you guys it's been over 1,800 days since you last beat us on the field. So we're gonna have to milk this for as much as we possibly can as Michigan fans between now and November 30th when we find out for whom the bell tolls. Okay, but big game this week. It's Big Ten game of the year for Ohio State and the Big Ten part due. The first one was at Oregon. The second one is the Penn State game here on the road at Happy Valley. And I'm just, I know there's a lot of discontentment, man, after that showing against Nebraska last week. There were concerns about the offensive line coming in. You go back to the Big Ten camp tour, and Jerry DiNardo basically said this looks like an NFL team everywhere except at the offensive line. And now Ohio State's left tackle is out for the year. The backup really struggled last week against Nebraska. Now he's hurt. And you're going up against maybe the best pass rush in the entire Big Ten, what Penn State brings off the edge. So, on the other hand, this has been the game that consistently, whether it's against guys in scarlet and gray or winged helmets, that James Franklin has not been able to win in this league since he's been here. So what's your read of Ohio State at Penn State? And it's not a whiteout, but a big noon Saturday. So that's an advantage there for the Buckeyes. So what's your read of where things are at with your team heading into this important game where if Ohio State loses, then you're out of probably the Big Ten, getting to the Big Ten championship game. And now you're scoreboard watching for one of the last few spots in the college football playoff down the stretch as well.
Yeah, this is serious time for the Buckeyes. I think if you look at the Nebraska game, everywhere on the field, Ohio State was superior and played at least a decent, solid game, if not an exceptional game. The playmakers made plays when they had the opportunity. Will Howard's playing extremely well. People pick out the one or two mistakes he makes a game. But again, he's a college quarterback. That's what they do. The defense was not dominant. I will not sell the defense as being dominant, but they gave up 17 points. They had four plays inside the 5-yard line to make a goal line stand that was key in this game. They played extremely well. They shut it down in the fourth quarter when they needed to after giving up the lead. Like, they played well all over the place. That just accentuates how important the offensive line is. And at that left tackle position, once that became up, like when you're watching a football game and your eyes are immediately drawn to one position on the offensive line over and over because that guy's just being thrown 3 yards in the backfield and it's just wreaking havoc, blowing up plays, like that is a serious issue, of course, and it did not allow them to run their offense. I don't believe in any way Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins have dropped from being what I consider to be the best tandem in all of college football, and they averaged 2.7 yards per carry in that game. And that's not on them. And when you are hamstrung in regards to calling a game, so Chip Kelly has to figure out, okay, I can't call the deep drop, the 7-step drop. I can't, and not that they take it from center anymore, but you know what I mean, taking those 8-9 routes downfield, can't do that with regularity, and that's where they burned Nebraska. They had a huge play that started off the last drive that scored the touchdown because they did get some time for Will Howard on that play, and then, of course, they had the Jeremiah Smith 60-yard play for a touchdown. But that's how the offensive line is just, to me, by and large, for any team, is the most important position. It's the most important assistant coach's position, and that's drawing to attention what you brought up at the beginning of your question, is that for as great as the recruiting has been at Ohio State, that you really have nothing to complain about. The metrics would tell us if we recruited and laid out the rankings per position, it's top 3 to 4 in the country everywhere, but offensive line, it might be top 20 to top 15. And even though that's a developmental position where you can do what Wisconsin did for years and maybe get a 4 and a 5-star once in a while, but basically develop 3 stars, they've done neither at Ohio State, and it's showing up. And if this whole thing gets derailed by a couple spots along the offensive line, wow, there should be hell to pay somewhere.
There will be if that happens. Yeah, and there will be. I'm kind of hoping you guys win this weekend, because if not, then you're out of the Big Ten race. And then you have nothing to play for the following weeks. You got every incentive to hang 100 on us over Thanksgiving weekend. On the other hand, if you're still in the Big Ten race, you may take it at least a little bit easy, only hang 50, and then let us off the hook in the second half and be merciful, which we would all appreciate over the holiday weekend, Mark.
Nebraska's not as good as Michigan. You guys should take some serious hope from that game. Now, we'll see how they adjust to the offensive line situation and if they can address that effectively. But Nebraska, when you think about this team and how they played offensively against Rutgers, Indiana, and the fourth quarter and overtime against Illinois, they were awful. This is not a good offensive football team in Nebraska. And so what Ohio State did on defense was serviceable, but it wasn't dominant. So to stick around with Nebraska and barely win at home, that's, usually I need 2 of those type games to say, okay, this is a trend, it's a concern. Mm-hmm. But I'm giving this a little bit more relevance than I would normally.
Good to see you, brother. Thank you very much, as always. No show next week, by the way. We're off next week, just so you know. All right?
Good, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you. This week's X-Poll results, we asked you what one word best sums up your reaction to Michigan's 24-17 victory over Sparty. 40% of you said, "Lil bro," quoting Colston Loveland there. 34% of you said, "Whew," that's where I was. 19% of you said, "Meh." 7.3% of you, "God bless you, I want you to be my boss." You said season saved. If that's your standard, I want to work for you. All right. That brings us to our feedback of the week. And we go to What You Mad Bruh, who says, "What are you smoking, you balding walrus?" I love your spelling of walrus there, by the way. I am the walrus, just so you know. But what are you smoking, you balding walrus? Just a joke of a peasant team that got lucky. If this was in East Lansing, your whole program would get belt to ass. Cope, you joke. Go make a podcast how your team still sucks. I just did. So thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you. Another satisfied customer here on Michigan Podcast. Don't forget, you can like, rate, subscribe. Am I balding still? Yeah, probably.
Can I interject something? Can I interject something real quick?
Of course you may.
We had that Spartan fan on Bigger 10 last week. I'm not trying to pick on him. Are they all like this?
No comment. No comment. Like, rate, subscribe, share, 5-star review. All those things help us to, whether it's right here on YouTube or on iTunes or elsewhere, it helps the algorithm to hunt down more Michigan fans just like you, and we greatly appreciate when you do that. You can also make sure to leave us a 5-star review. I said that already, didn't I? Oh, follow us on Twitter in between episodes as well, at Michigan Podcast, there on what's now known as X. All right, for Aaron McIntyre, normally silent during this segment because he hates Michigan like many Spartans do. And then for myself, I am Steve Dace. We'll see you in 2 weeks right here on Michigan Podcast. Until then, go Blue.